Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our Women for Solutions weekly webinars. You will be truly inspiring with our speakers, John Elkington and Louise Roper, on the topic that you will love is Green Swans and the coming boom in regenerative capitalism. Women for Solutions, formerly Be Women Solutions, is a global network of thousands of women entrepreneur and intrapreneur in over 40 countries that seek to balance purpose and profits in a more caring economy, an economic system that focuses primarily on the wellness of people and planet. As a founder of this network, we are proud to share that today is our 108th Women for Solutions webinar, where we create awareness, we connect, we learn, we inspire to action to reimagine an amazing world. Let's now introduce today our incredible moderator, Ellie Ingraham, one of our Women for Solutions board members and co-CEO or COO of Tire Global Artisans, a system of entrepreneurship that elevates artisans and their communities through innovation and entrepreneurship programs, de-risk supply chain, and access to global markets. Eli, the line is all yours.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone. John and Louise, it is really wonderful to see you again, and I am so delighted to be your host today. Everyone, let me introduce John Elkington, co-founder and chief pollinator of Volans, a London-based change agency. He was faculty member of the World Economic Forum from 2002 to 2008 and was inducted into the Sustainability Hall of Fame in 2013 for pioneering the global sustainability movement, an effort for which he earned the moniker the Godfather of Sustainability. He has served on over 70 boards, has won numerous awards, and is the author or co-author of 20 books. In his spare time, he co-founded 4 social enterprises, and in 2018 had the audacity to recall the triple bottom line concept, an idea he coined in 1994, initiating the first business management principle recall ever. We're also joined by John's colleague, Louise Kjellerup Roper, who is CEO of Volans, and Louise brings her own full measure of badassery to the table, having successfully launched, run, and advised numerous high-impact cradle-to-cradle and circular economy brands across Europe. Her goal now is to evolve Volans as the world's foremost advisory to ambitious leaders driving value for people and planet. After all that, yes, I too am shocked. They said yes to my invitation, but here they are. So we're going to get started. We'll have 20 to 30 minutes of presentation by John and Louise, followed by 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. We have a hard stop at 10:15 Eastern, 3:15 GMT. And for those submitting questions in the chat, please preference them with a Q:, just so it's they're more easy for me to find and fold into the dialogue. And John and Louise, I'll put questions out to you generally and have you decide who and how you want to respond. So with that, let's get started. And let me kick it off by just asking you about the genesis of Green Swans.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Laura. Wonderful to see you, everyone else, although it's slightly sort of jammed up on the screen. So forgive us if we don't immediately recognize some of you at least. We decided we're going to do something slightly different, and for several reasons. What we decided we would at least try was, rather than throwing another PowerPoint deck at you, we would have some form of conversation. We'll pick up, Ellie, on your question around Green Swans, but just sort of some interplay between the two of us. And part of the reason for that is that when I look back at my career, well, firstly, when I was asked by Ellie to do this, I thought, oh my God, what am I doing talking as a man to all of these women, or mainly women? I thought maybe I could pull somebody else in who would be better suited. But actually, once I thought about it, and once we thought about it, it's remarkable how through much of my life, I've worked with clearly other people, but particularly other women or women.
John?
Yes, I must be careful. But I don't know why it is, but it's always been a very interesting balancing act. But what I'm going to try and do is address that Green Swans question. And of the 20...
I'm going to stop you for a second first.
Yeah, fire away.
No, I'm just going to say also hello and welcome before I get...
Thank you.
And I was thrilled. So John and I do work together almost every day, most days especially when we used to be in the office. But most of the time I like him to stand in the limelight and do his talking and talk about especially his fabulous books that most people will have touched on one or two of them maybe. But I think there's another reason when we talked about doing this together, which was that there is a shift happening in lots of areas of the world. And one of them is, this is me, I'm Danish, so that's my excuse for being quite blunt, is a handover from white males to women. And much as I'm not very keen on public speaking a lot, it is a mantle that we all have to pick up. And that's one of the reasons why we absolutely couldn't say no to you, Ellie and Laura. A network built for women to take a stand and change the world is exactly where we need to be. So thank you for having us. And now I'll let John.
Maybe what I'll do there is just bounce off the sort of not just the gender piece, but the generational piece, because I'm 71, and I find quite a number of people who are more or less my age, baby boomers, are getting to the point where they want to retire or have retired already. I really don't. I've never wanted to retire, and I feel the next 10 to 15 years are going to be by far the most exciting, challenging, and at times dangerous of my entire working career. But the reason why I'm saying all of that is because I think what we need to do is bridge between the generations. It's not good enough for a particular generation to say, we tried and now over to you lot. This challenge of ours, this opportunity of ours, is a pan-generational challenge, and it's a pan-generational opportunity if we get it right. So I'm really looking forward to the next 10 to 15 years, but without any sort of question or doubt in my mind that it's going to be at times pretty tough. And one of the things that we've done over the years with Volans, which was set up in 2012, was to keep it very small, to keep it much smaller than perhaps the market would naturally have it. And part of the reason for that was that gave us the flexibility, the freedom to do stuff that we wouldn't have been able to do if we'd been strapping on lots of additional people over time. And just in retrospect, Louise joined us about 2.5 years ago. 2.5 years ago?
Yeah, almost 3.
Well, yeah. So, and came into an organization which was, that was almost an exaggeration. It was semi-organized at times, but it was actually
held together by magic, is what I used to say.
And brown paper and string to some degree. And it's funny. It's the Wizard of Oz thing that outside people will often look into an organization and think it's doing interesting things and therefore must be extraordinary. But very often it's people who are just doing their damnedest because they care for a mission, and out of that comes good stuff. And in a way, what Louise has been doing for us is not sort of growing us up particularly, but putting in place some of the systems that we needed and so on. And so some of the things that we do with clients, for example, we can talk later on about the sort of client work we do and what we try and help particularly client companies and to some degree financial institutions do, how that often works but doesn't always. And I wonder in a way whether, I've partly been skittling and skedaddling around the Green Swans thing. Let me just knock that one off and then we'll come back to the rest of it. So every so often I just get into my head that I want to write a book. My family and my colleagues very often sort of clutch their heads and run for the hills. But about 2.5 years ago, more or less when Louise was coming into our world. I was thinking then of writing a book about artificial intelligence. And part of the reason I was thinking of that was I'd begun to go and see people like Hewlett-Packard, DeepMind before they were bought by Google, some of the organizations that were getting into algorithms and big data and expert systems and artificial intelligence. And I find some of these people absolutely ferociously intelligent, really difficult to properly understand when you were talking to them. It was a bit like drinking at the fire hose, as people used to say. And then over time, I found that my spotlight was shifting somewhat. And it was AI is one of the technologies now which is exponential. It brings with it the potential to take whatever we're doing and transform it. So Lara, just before we were coming on the call, talking about magic and so on. And there is a form of magic around AI if you choose to sort of believe in it. But also, as we're starting to see, it has many darker sides, many problems associated with it. So I started to think about black swans, and I started to think in particular about the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and the book that he published in 2007, just ahead of the financial meltdown, and what he meant by a financial or a black swan in particular was something that was a complete surprise. It sort of came out of the blue. It had an off-the-scale level of impact, and afterwards we thought we'd understood what had just happened to us, but sadly we really hadn't. So black swans were in my brain. So I thought, what would it be like? Because most black swans are things that take you exponentially where you don't want to go, to put it crudely. What would it be like if we could move in the opposite direction? So you could go exponentially over time towards where you do want to go. And I started to sort of look around for examples. And the book really was an account of that adventure.
And I guess, and sort of tying that back to some of the stuff that happened at Volans, this idea of what we worked with the UN Global Compact around the SDGs being an exponential agenda for the future.
Not that they wanted to know that.
No, yes. No, not at the time. But this idea that, to eradicate poverty by 2030, let alone, or by 2090 or 2070, we have to see exponential change rather than that. So that exponential idea has been in your work for a long time, and has been in our work, I guess, as long as I've been around. And
it sort of led to frustration in a way. There was somebody who's just left the Global Compact, where she was executive director for many years, Lisa Kingo. And I worked with her for many years at Novo Nordisk in Denmark, the healthcare company. And when she took over the Global Compact, she and I both happened to be in Madrid. And I was giving a talk at a conference, and I was quite rude about United Nations organizations. I think they're the best UN organizations that we have, but they're really often not fit for purpose in what's coming next. So I said some of this stuff, but in a sort of a suitably polite and friendly tone. Came back and sat down beside her, expecting to be pummeled or thumped. And in fact, she's hissed in my ear, when do we start? And we then started a program of work, just going to see, on behalf of business, some of the people playing into the exponential world, Singularity University, X Prize, Google's X facility, and so on, just to get a sense of what was potentially coming at us. And that's in a way where the two things came. One was the book, but the other one was the recall of the triple bottom line, which I did in 2018. And the reason I did that was just a deep sense of frustration that what we had originally designed to be and intended to be, a system change framework, was actually being used for trade-offs. Now, nothing intrinsically wrong with trade-offs, but if you're trying to change the world, that's not going to get you very far. So through the Harvard Business Review, some of you may know, I withdrew that. But then the really important element that followed from that was where Volans started what we've called our Tomorrow's Capitalism inquiry.
That sounds like a pause for me. Yeah, and so the idea of the Tomorrow's Capitalism inquiry was this, how, the question really we asked ourselves was, how can businesses play a catalytic role in changing the whole system? How can you have responsible businesses that have got better and better over the years, partly with help from the triple bottom line, B Corps and so on, less and less harm, and yet they're still, and like the analogy we used in the office was, they're clean fish but swimming around in a really dirty ocean. How do we help the fish learn to clean the ocean? That was really how that started, straight off the back of the recalling the triple bottom line.
And in a way, to start with, that was just done with a small number of companies like Unilever. Well, there aren't many companies like Unilever, but Paul Polman, just as he was leaving as CEO, put some funding into the project. And a number of other companies, some of which have been in this space for a long time, one of them being the Body Shop International. And we've been exploring that question of where capitalism needs to go next. And because of that work, we've got pulled into organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, so a couple of hundred major companies. And we've done, I think, 3 or 4 projects now with WBCSD, one of which has refreshed the work they did exactly 10 years ago on what they call Vision 2050, looking out to the future. We've been helping them with that. But we've also done another study looking at the impact and implications of COVID-19 for the global economy and for business and so on.
Something just strikes me. So we talked a little bit with Laura and Ellie before the call about the network and what we had, and could we somehow work together? And I'm now preempting this, Ellie, so sorry if this is meant to be a separate call. But one of the things that just struck me, Tomorrow's Capitalism Inquiry ran from late 2018. And we looked at what are the functions of a company and how can they be used for greater purpose. There are some really interesting conclusions, but one of the things we've have done that's not been published yet is a tiny little Quizlet or a tool for managers, for people in business who can say, okay, so how far are we in moving from being a responsible business, that clean fish swimming around in a dirty sea, to actually starting to clean. So we call it a regenerative business. So what we've talked about, and maybe you want to explain it, is the triple bottom line still stands. It was recalled. We looked at it. We pummeled it very, very hard to see if it still stood up. And what we found was that it's still incredibly valid, but you can't just have it in the responsibility sphere. You have to layer on resilience. So in how you build that organization, and then the regenerative. So not just doing less harm, but actively adding value, regenerating both the environment, but also communities, also employees, and all, I want to say stakeholders, but all involved in your ecosystem as a company.
I think one of the problems with language, and we all know it, having set up a company called Sustainability in 1987, when nobody knew that term and we had to spell it, the word, for 3 to 4 years afterwards. Now sustainability is everywhere, and it's not meaningless yet, but people have been working very hard to mainstream it and diluting it along the way. Now, I think sustainability as a concept will be there in 100 years. I don't think there's any question of that. It'll be like liberty or democracy or these great terms. But regeneration is at some risk of going the same route. And I think one of our great friends, Joel Makawa of Greenbiz in the States, recently did an editorial where he just said, suddenly everything is regenerative. Everything, whether it's fashion or whether it's agriculture or whether it's whatever it is. And I was on a call earlier on today with a pet food company.
Remain nameless.
They will remain nameless, but I think they're well disposed to this whole change agenda, but they were already talking about regenerative agriculture and what they're doing. And I think we have to be very careful in all of this. So in a way, what we have done with sort of gently reintroducing the triple bottom line back into the stream is to say, as long as we think of the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, as something that is done pretty much exclusively in the world of responsibility, then we really do have a problem, because you cannot be responsible to get yourself out of a systemic crisis or systemic trap. So we're not attacking responsibility in any way at all.
No.
In fact, responsibility as an agenda is expanding even further during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, for example, you've got focus on wealth divides, which people have been talking about for a long time, but really hadn't come through into the CSR, corporate social responsibility agenda, in any meaningful way. You've got things like public healthcare provision, again coming through very strongly. You've got tax havens and tax avoidance. It's not that the responsibility agenda has stopped evolving, far from it. But if you listen to the words that politicians are using now, if you listen to the words that CEOs and investors are using, very often what they're talking about is resilience. Now, they're talking about individual resilience, they're talking about organizational and team resilience, they're talking about supply chain resilience, and if they're sort of treasurers or secretaries of state for the economy or whatever, they're talking about economic resilience. And many people are suddenly assuming, because I want resilience, I can have it. And what they haven't properly understood, I don't think yet, is that what we've done over years now, and Roger Martin is one of the people academics who's been saying this forever, what we've done is, by driving efficiency into our globalizing economies, we squeezed out resilience. So the systems that we now rely on, economic, social, natural environment, they're much less resilient than they once would have been. So how do you regenerate that resilience? How do you rebuild that resilience, restore it, whatever? And the only answer, I think, is to regenerate those systems. And in a sense, in the simple logic, that's what has got us to the point where we're saying to people, if you will use the triple bottom line in the responsibility, resilience, and critically the regenerative framing, absolutely fine. You can use it as you want. But if you're simply going to sort of spend it and invest it and work with it in the responsibility area, we don't think that's actually going to move the needle.
But it's a big ask, right? Because what we're asking people is to stop thinking about their businesses, as we have for many decades, in kind of a bubble. And say, okay, so you have some stakeholders out there, and most companies will still draw themselves in the center of whatever ecosystem they're in, and then you have this kind of lines out to stakeholders. And the resilience and especially the regenerative agenda forces you to think about yourself as a small part of a very big complex system, which of course is both society and the environment. And that's where it's going to be interesting, because we need new language, we need new types of leadership. All these things have to come together to drive that change. And that change is what, I guess, is a green swan I see, Ellie.
This would be actually a great moment to start introducing some of our questions, just because you touched on one at the beginning. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to do that. So question one has to do with leadership. Many listening are CEOs and executives, others are business coaches and consultants. And while we see emerging signs that we are living in an age of activist CEOs, you had a delightfully provocative statement in the book that said corporations are psychopaths. So I would love to ask, how do we inculcate an exponential mindset in our business leaders? How can we convince them to embrace what you call the absolute versus incremental goals that catalyze breakthrough thinking?
That's what we spend a lot of our time doing. John, this is the Volans.
Before I try and answer that, or we answer that, let me just say a couple of things. One is, I've already said that we're a very small organization. What that enables us to do is to work with a very small group of major companies, very close in and over some time, in order to get a sense of what works and what doesn't. So that's very important to us. I mean, we are pro-business, but we're not completely critical, and there are quite a number of types of company and so on, business wouldn't work with. When I think about that sort of, psychosis point, it wasn't mine. It came from a film and a book that came out quite some years ago. I did chair the London launch of that, and I think it's broadly true, and it's true not because CEOs and CFOs and people like that are constitutionally psychotic. They're not, but they operate a game whose rules have been constructed over time in order to get a certain set of outcomes. And many of you will know that the New York Times this week marked the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's article in the Times about the business of business being to make a profit. And in a way, at the time, that was a useful provocation. But over the decades, it's become less and less useful, to the point where now I think it's actually actively dangerous. So are individual business people psychotic? Well, some of them will be, of course they will be, but mainly not. But this is a systemic crisis that we face. It's about the rules of the game. It's about economics. It's about valuation. It's how we put prices on things. And that's, I think, where we've now got to focus next.
And yet, the only way to shift that system is also if we're shifting on the personal level, right? And
I wish you hadn't said that. It would be so much easier.
Oh, I have a question for that too. So.
Yes. So there's going to be some personal work here, is there? Right?
No, but I actually think that's exactly what there is. That what we're seeing, and back to the leadership piece, is the time where companies, and I think the psychotic is because we've trained leaders up to this day and age almost to not bring the personal into work. You have the professional, and then you have the personal, and the leaders we see that we have the kind of huge privilege of working with are leaders who have brought in their own sensibilities and their personality, and have seen, and often it's a grandchild or a daughter been they get challenged. Are you really part of this? Are you not fixing it? But they've brought the whole selves in, and that, I think, is a major shift, because unless we all do that, the systemic shift just won't happen. The systemic shift won't happen automatically either, but we have to have that personal as well as the.
So let me ask you, let's get into that, because one of my favorite quotes is Tolstoy's, who says, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so you talk about the need to evolve ourselves as well as capitalism and democracy, but how do we actually make paradigm shifting personal? How do we become chief reinvention officers, as you say, or future fit in our own lives? How do we do that?
Do you want me to do it? Do you want to have
I'll have a go, but yeah, it's really complicated, but it's doable. And the single book that had the biggest impact on my life, I read when I was 14. It was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it was the book that introduced, published in the early 60s, the notion of paradigm shift. And what I've seen since then is people come to understand paradigm shifts as, it's a change in the formulation of a toothpaste, or it's a different sort of tire on a car or whatever. That's a paradigm shift in mobility or dental hygiene or whatever it is. But that's not what Kuhn meant, and you all know it. But what he meant was points that every 60 to 80 years, when our societies go through a moment where, for example, we suddenly realize that rather than the heavens going around the earth, we're sort of racing around them. Or now with the Gaian hypothesis, that we're actually on this tiny little planet, which is linked in ferociously complicated ways that we've hardly even begun to understand. So that for me is a proper paradigm shift. So to the question, what can people do to shift the paradigm? Well, the least that they can do is to be moderately conversant with where the science says that we're actually headed, and what we then need to do to turn that around. Also, I think all of us have to be very acutely aware that none of us can do this on our own. And one of the things that we're seeing in the companies that we're working with, even the very biggest companies in the world now are saying, this is too big for us. We've helped create it, but we don't know how to turn this thing around. And therefore, one of the reasons why I think Milton Friedman is now so profoundly wrong is that one of the things that you may all remember him saying was that if you put in the federal government in the United States in charge of the Sahara Desert, we'd run out of sand in 5 years. Well, it's a lovely, memorable saying, but we actually need government. We need the right sort of government. We need it to be accountable and clean and effective and all that sort of stuff. But I think we're in one of those moments where, in order to make the paradigm shift that we all increasingly sense that we're going to have to make, we need much more effective government, but government now working very closely with the private sector, with business, with financial markets, and with civil society too.
I'm going to pick up on, so you said obviously be conversant with the science, and I think that's hugely important and not as easy as one might think because of fake news and the way we're getting sort of sidetracked down. I saw that Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix at the weekend, and if you haven't seen it, it's frightening, but worth watching. But there's that, but there's also, as far as I can see, and I think actually this pandemic has helped some people at least with this, is figuring out how to nourish yourself, because only if you're self-nourished as a human being can you, and I saw there was something in the chat, you can sit with ambiguity, you can collaborate from a position of abundance. And our team gets a little bit bored. I keep going, we need to model abundance, we need to collaborate with everyone, but really, unless you really nourish yourself as a human being, that's really hard, because then your own uncertainties can pop up. And I think that's important, both as a leader, but also within companies. Even if you're not the CEO, if people can nourish themselves, then they can start and then inform themselves with the science. Then you can move on and you can start changing things for the better.
Yeah,
it's both ways. Systems
a very
and
quick
personal
comment on science is, most of us assume that we have to learn science at school. And I did up until I was 14, then for various reasons gave it up. But I came back to science in my 20s and actually learned an enormous amount during that period. So I don't think science is ever closed to any of us. But I think now we're at one of those moments where several things are happening at the same time. The world in which we've grown up is starting to come apart. And that's frightening, and it's we don't want to know it, but it's actually true. And the world which was built by Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan and the United Nations and so on, that is disassembling around us. Now, the good news is that if we're clever and this works out, there's a better world on the other side. But this isn't going to end in a U-shaped, V-shaped, W-shaped recovery or whatever. There may well be those, but we've got something like a 12 to 15 to 20 year time period now where that old order comes apart and something else starts to self-assemble. And in a way, the old order has to go for the new stuff to be able to begin to find its feet. But the struggle, the fight, the battle, I'm sorry about using those terms, but it's going to be an existential exercise to sort of build the new, is going to be both incredibly character forming, but actually weirdly at the time incredibly fun too. So
no, it will. And the optimistic front is that we have all the technology, we have all the funding, we know everything we need to know to build this.
It's a shame about the politicians.
They'll come around, I'm sure.
Or those that won't.
Let me ask, picking up that thread, how do we incentivize long-termism or even long-term optimism? Elise Spaulding in your book says if one is mentally out of breath all the time from dealing with the present, where's the energy left for imagining the future? I think particularly in COVID-19, people are kind of suffering from that. How do we get that long-termism?
Well, several things.
Collective mindset.
Do you want to have a go, or shall I go?
Go for it.
Well, one of the I've always been fascinated by the future, and I've always had far too much stamina for my own good, and so I'm constantly pushing into the future, and at times it's a slightly lonely task, but every so often you break into realms of people who are thinking about the future in really interesting ways. So, for example, I've been recently reading a certain amount of Chinese science fiction, not because it's radically better than Western science fiction, but by God, it's different. And their sense of time, their sense of space is significantly differentiated from ours. And then just about last week, there was a group here in London called Climate Kick, which is about investing in very, very deep innovation to address climate, and they put together 16 people, just and all on Zoom. But we had a glass of wine and things like that was sent to us. And but what was really, really interesting about it was that these were people I'd not heard of before, but thinking about the deep future in ways that I found absolutely, well, delightful in a way. One of them has just written a book called The Good Ancestor Guide. And if you haven't come across it, I recommend it really, really highly. It's trying to say, it's going back to Jonas Salk and his comment around polio vaccines. How can we each be a good ancestor? How do we live our lives in such a way that is true? And I think this book is an extraordinary demonstration of the part of the human brain that asks those sorts of questions, and then some of the experience that some interesting people have built up along the way. So I don't think it's easy. I think there's something about our cultures and civilizations that has increasingly become more narrowly focused on the now and on sort of rather more immediate gratification. And that's going to end in a bad way. There's no question about it. So we've got to turn that corner.
I think with COVID-19 especially, the obvious tension between self-interest and common good is really, really at the forefront. And you write that social norms play a critical role in sort of mitigating that self-interest. So how do we steward social norms in the right direction as positive exponentials? How do we do that in our personal and civic lives?
Well, I'd love to hear from other people. I mean, and Louise, but also other people on the call, because I'll make one comment and then see what other people have to say, which is that I originally went to university to study economics. I gave it up after 1 year in 1968 because it had very little to do with what was going on in the wider world. I switched to sociology and social psychology. And so exactly that sort of social norm stuff is what began to exercise me. And in a way, I think our societies have sort of come to rely on social capital that was provided by earlier generations. Now, that's not exclusively true. There's some wonderful people, including everyone on this network, but we've been a little bit more prepared than I think we should have been to just accept what we had got and not invest in the next round of social norms. And I don't mean social norms for their own sake. I mean, they do rein people in, and whether that's drugs. I mean, I took LSD when I was in the 60s, but drugs do have to be reined in. Crime has to be reined in, and cyber fraud and all these sorts of things. And so work is being done, but are we really as a species paying proper attention to how that's done, how that's best done, and how we might do it better?
No,
I'm not sure that
not
we are.
as yet.
No.
Is the answer to that one. I would close that.
Yeah.
But we also have to be careful that I think, and it's lovely to see a really international group here, that it does vary from country to country.
Totally.
And we have, for better and for worse, sort of accepted a lot of, partly because of technology, of what American social norms have been imported. I see it, as a Dane living in the UK, I can see the social norms there changing slightly, actually to be more individualistic, which I would associate with the US, versus the slightly more community-based spirits that you had when I was growing up in Denmark many years ago.
Yeah, and I just wonder whether many of our social norms are not created in stress. So, you know, our human rights norms and our legal norms and so on, they're products of periods of intense stress. Where, and I mentioned earlier on Bretton Woods. We got in 1944 to Bretton Woods because we'd gone through the crucible of the Second World War, and we really didn't want to go there again. And therefore we were prepared to sacrifice sovereignty and things like that in order to have a degree of the greater good. And I think there's a pulsing in all of this, so that I think about a couple of generations from a time when you've had a period of really acute stress, people start to forget, they start to take for granted. I don't want to sound like an old man
Really?
thumping my drum, but historically, I think there is a rhythm there, and I think it's something we've got to be aware of, and if we can, push back against.
Laura brings up a really great question in the chat about how regenerativeness comes from agriculture, and would love for you to expand on the idea of regenerative economy, biomimicry, and things like that. Can you say more on that?
Well, we could. I guess it does start with soils, always, and agriculture.
Yeah.
But maybe just because that's more obvious, whereas for the economy, I don't know, actually you should take this one, I think. You've got your down pat on this.
Well, no,
Yes.
I grew up on farms in Northern Ireland when I was very young, before we traveled elsewhere. And I was put in touch with the soil in a way that many urban children now are not. But I saw this was a cusp. It was a period in the 1950s when farming was going from something that broadly sustained the soil, or at least didn't damage it too badly, into a period, and these were farms that were like Albania in the 1990s. They were really, really under capitalized and so on. And then we had, fertilizers, we had pesticides, all these sorts of things coming in, and some of the benefits of that were really quite considerable, clearly, but many of the costs were way bigger than anyone imagined. I used to go in the 80s and 90s to research laboratories that were run by big chemical companies studying insects and fish and so on. I think if anyone told them then that now we'd have something like 70% of insects having disappeared, they simply would not credit it. It wasn't within their realms of possibility. And in the same way, forest management and climate change, you look at Donald Trump going to California and saying it's going to cool down. And that's the sum total of his wisdom on the matter, when it's absolutely clear with anyone with half a brain that the climate is starting to destabilize. California is at the leading edge of that, but we're all going to find ourselves in the leading edge of that. So I think soils are fundamental. Unless and until we can go back and properly regenerate our soils, our civilization has no hope. In my own country and Louise's country of the United Kingdom, well, at least now, we are told that we have 60 harvests left. 60 harvests. And hopefully we can turn that one around. But there are so many other aspects of regenerating the forests, regenerating the mangrove swamps, regenerating coral reefs, it just goes on and on, regenerating the fisheries. The level of investment that we have to make as a species, if we're really going to truly regenerate our systems, is almost akin to what people did in the Marshall Plan, that sort of period. It was very self-interested in a way. People didn't want to be overrun by the communists, but I think we've got one of those moments where we either decide to address these challenges in an effective way, or they will sweep us away. I don't think there's any doubt about
maybe
it.
I will expand a little bit. So, so I'm on a regenerative finance group, Laura, for the Common Earth through the Commonwealth, where we're looking at specifically how can you take funds and money and funnel it to regenerative products and then projects. So specifically in the Caribbean, in some of the island nations that desperately need their ecosystems. So it still comes back to the farm, if not farming, to nature, I would argue. And when we talk about regenerative social norms, it comes down to people and the environment. It is, there's a saying, I used to go on about it for a little while we were doing To Nourish Capitalism in the beginning, is that the business model or the purpose of the economy or whatever you're doing has to be inextricably linked to, so that when financial value is created, social and environmental value is also created, not on the side, but you can't, we have to put together these systems, whether it's for our business or for our community or politics, that value, financial value, automatically increases the environmental value or the social value. And when I say that social and environmental, I mean by regenerating, because that's what's needed now. We have depleted so far that that's the only value to bring is to start regenerating.
And that is where biomimicry then comes in, because I was 6 years on the board of Janine Benyus's Biomimicry 3.8, and I love the stuff that those sorts of people are doing. And I think in 40 to 50 years, much of that stuff will be taken for granted in the way that we currently take, I don't know, televisions or computers for granted or whatever. But there's a very big challenge between where we are now and where we need to be. Now, it may well be taken by some of the people on this Zoom call as almost sort of taken for granted, at least, that I'm a pessimist. I'm not. I actually believe that our species can do extraordinary things if given little option but to do them. Some people will always step up in the right way, but the broad mass of people really have to be encouraged. And I think we're in a very, very close distance from when people suddenly wake up to the sheer scale of what's happening all around them and want someone to act, if it's not exactly going to be them in the first instance. Whether you look in California, whether you look in Amazonia, whether you look in places like Siberia, where the fires are breaking out. If you look in Australia, where 5 billion animals have been killed, what does it take for our species to sort of finally wake up? And just a final point on that, David Attenborough, some of you will know, the nature conservationists and so on, now in his 90s, did a program on extinction a couple of evenings ago, and it was terrifying. And now, one can be polite and one can sort of not discuss this stuff in public, not frighten the children and so on, but that is the reality and increasingly that we face. And Louise said earlier on with To Nourish Capitalism, we did an event in January co-hosted by Aviva Investors, 300 people. We're going to do it again next year. And right the way across this very grand, modern corporate building in the city of London was this slogan which we put there, and it said, "Step up or get out of the way." Now, we don't mean to be impolite, but we've got to that point where either we do step up and really take these challenges seriously and these opportunities seriously, or let's just let some other people through who are better qualified.
That leads in, I could see on the chat, I could see Marissa saying, what about young people? Yeah. And that's exactly bang on right. That's where we have to bring them in. And we have to bring them in a way where we don't contaminate them with pessimism. So I'm a mum of 3 children. Well, one has just gone out of teenage, and it's really hard for that young generation who understand it, who have woken up, to then not come up against us lot saying, well, we've tried that and that won't work,
Yeah.
and get back to school. So I think that's one of the crucial roles that I'm not seeing that many kind of grown-ups play at this point, which is to create the conditions for them to tackle this without being either totally overwhelmed or stepping completely out of the current system, which they also have to compete in. They're stuck between this old system and the demands on them now of schooling and doing this, that, and the other. And then the new bit, that's where I would like to see some social entrepreneurship, really, is how do we create the conditions?
Point, I just want to underscore, your whole point of intergenerational equity is really profound, and you see it iterated in the chat. I know we have some educators on the call today, and I just want to kind of bring you back to some of a point where you ask in the book, like, how do we get sustainable finance, financial citizenship, and even cultural literacy baked into the national curriculum? How do we get it into the education system so that these young minds are coming up, in that ecology?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Richard Curtis, many of you will know, the film director for Weddings and a Funeral, things
Love
like that.
Actually, all that.
Many of you will know is launching a new campaign, and it's very much around financial literacy. And I think it's one of those really difficult areas of the map, which educators and others, social entrepreneurs, people like My Bank and Aflatoon and so on, they've set up schemes to try and get children to think more about money and manage it better. But the depth of ignorance around money, if you look certainly in my country of the UK, our country of the UK, there are great pockets of people who just don't have money. And so I think we've got to be very careful not to be glib and come up with sort of very ready, sort of press this button and everything will be solved. And yet, unless and until we solve people's difficulties, let's put it that way, with dealing with money, I think we're going to have systemic problems for quite some period of time. And that goes through into pensions. So, for example, we want people to have good pensions. It's a lovely idea. Richard Curtis is very much playing into that area, but he's also asking the question, as you invest in a pension, are you investing it in a pension that is sustainable, that is fair, that is inclusive, that's climate friendly or climate neutral or whatever it is? And just very recently, having had a family pension, because I've been freelance for a very long time, I had somebody come in and look at our pension portfolio, such as it is, and it was all invested in socially responsible investment and ethical investment funds. And he found all sorts of things there that shouldn't have been there. So I'm not saying don't invest in that area, but if you're going to, be very careful how you do it. And it then took us 5 months to get out of the investments that we had into something that was properly, I felt, suitable for the next sort of 10 to 15 years. So it's not as easy for people to do this, even if they're minded to do so. So we've got to make it easier. So when they do,
and it's coming, right? There are lots of fintech that's coming.
It is.
But there's still a long way to go yet.
Mm-hmm. When we think at the individual level, clearly how we vote, how we spend, and how we invest are at least low-hanging fruit ways, right? We can kind of move forward. Louisa asks an interesting question. How we can, where did it go, tackle diseducation, climate denial, and things like that in the mass media. Really interesting question. Diseducation.
No, but it's so true.
It's so good.
I think we should hold climate deniers liable, their families liable, for the costs imposed on other peoples around the world out to the 7th generation. Now that's me being slightly over dramatic, but I actually think that unless we make this consequential, unless we make people who, for all sorts of reasons, stubbornness, ignorance, but very often vested interests, they want to protect an industry that's going to continue earning money for them for a period of time. and the rest of the world can go hang. Unless we make that consequential. The Koch brothers, for example, just to take one unholy pairing, I think that they should be sued for every cent, every penny that they have, because they have been complicit in this book, The Good Ancestor that I talked about, has this sort of phrase of colonizing the future. So in the same way that we colonized land in the past, and we went into the Americas, we went into Australia or whatever, we would describe that land as terra nullius, i.e. no one lived there, but of course they did. We're now talking about time being tempus nullius. So no one lives in the future, so we can do whatever we want with the future. And I think when we talk about paradigms earlier on, that level of impact that the current people currently alive have on our future is something that somehow we've got to get into people. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if they learn to manage money if they don't have that other sense.
And I love that phrase, even though it's terribly sad, the colonizing of the future. However, I'm gonna turn. I don't think we should sue them. I think that's old school. I think we should. I think we should raise money, and actually we should re-educate them, Louisa. I reckon. Use the tools of the social media, and again, I cannot recommend the Social Dilemma enough. But anyway, and use the social media and digital. Again, it's my background in tech and fast-moving consumer goods. Let's use those tactics and re-educate them, because it's actually not that hard. If you start doing, Facebook does great targeted ads. And mostly it's being used by the wrong people is the issue. Not only, of course, but that's where we should go.
Well, good luck with Trump supporters, among others.
Oh, but, you would be surprised.
Yes.
Don't get us started. So in a similar vein, I can't let you go, and we're not there yet, but it's 10. We got about 15 minutes of your time. I get asked, and I know many here also get asked, about benchmarks and impact assessment. And you can see that there are a growing number of competing frameworks. Is there a universal framework that's emerging? Is there a global aggregator so we can actually look at impact on a macro scale? And then as an aside, I'd love to have you explain more about your Future Fit business benchmark and how that relates to the SDGs and Singularity University's 12-point framework. I think this is a huge...
So John, that's a bit of a last question. No, so John knows more about benchmarks than most people, because he helped set up a few of them and then ditched them the minute they got a little bit boring and mainstream.
Once they were able to stand on their feet, really.
So the first, and I know most of you will know about the B impact assessment, which, and Lara was saying she's gone through it 4 times. I can't. This is Volans is the third business, small business I worked in that's a B Corp. So I've gone through it a few times, and it's a great starter. Future Fit is much more comprehensive, and the concept behind it is really interesting, because it's not measuring you against what you did last year, which benchmarks tend to do, nor against your competitors, which benchmark tends to do, but against where you need to be. But the downside is, somebody described it the other day as the father of all benchmarks, that it incorporates everything. So most companies won't have the teams and the resources to really go through with it in detail, but it's absolutely worth looking at. Do you want to?
Which is very quickly. I mean, I started out doing environmental impact assessments in the early 1970s, and it was a wonderful learning opportunity. But most of those assessments just went on shelves somewhere. And I think now, 50, 60 years later, surely we're in a much better position, in the sense that we do have big data and expert systems and artificial intelligence and so on. Why could we not put in a lot of these frameworks and so on, and just turn the handle and come up with something dramatically better that could link into satellite remote sensing, that could link into all sorts of different forms of data input? We could do it. But it's the question of whether we've got the will to
And
do
the
it.
World Benchmarking Alliance has started to
They started.
do it.
It's a very, very slow
But
roll, but yes.
it's going for, so the World Benchmarking Alliance is trying to do exactly that, but just in very slow. It's going a lot slower than I think they were expecting.
Yeah,
and
and
they're
I think
starting
that
sector by sector.
in a way, the total quality management, when that came in, it imposed benchmarking on all sorts of different people who hadn't previously done that sort of stuff. And then by extension, we brought it into the environmental and sustainability and so on spaces. And it's not that it doesn't do good work, but as many people have said, it benchmarks within. It looks at a company against its peer companies. What it doesn't look at is the state of the entire planet and the extent to which a particular company or supply chain or whatever industry, economy, takes a proportion of the resources and does whatever it does, including polluting or destroying them. I think we need that external benchmarking piece there, and that's part of what the Future Fit Business Benchmark is designed to do. So it's not just simply saying, you're a 10 out of 10 because somebody over there is 9 out of 10. It's saying, because you take this amount of the planetary resource and you're generating this amount of income or whatever it happens to be, we can give you a much more precise reading on how you're doing. Now that's still work in progress, but for me that's quite hopeful.
It is very, very good, and they do kind of free courses. So even for smaller businesses who won't go through the whole benchmark, I'm certain, just looking at the criteria is a helpful exercise. Because you start thinking a little bit more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you also...
Sorry. I was just going to say, is getting hung up on trying to figure out which framework to use, kind of looking at the trees, not the forest? Should we just sort of get on with the work of, transforming companies and mindsets? I mean, sometimes we struggle with, should we be trying to work within some kind of global aggregator so that there can be sort of positive reporting to encourage people? I mean, how much does it matter?
I think if you're going on a long journey, having a compass is not only a help, it's sometimes absolutely crucial to your survival. And I think it's the same way with the right sort of benchmarks. The question is, do the benchmarks that you're using cover all the things you should be measuring and comparing? And very often they cover some, but not all. And very often the ones that they don't cover in terms of future generations, the ones that are the most important, and they might feel you should actually be applying. But you mentioned Singularity University and so on, and their approach to, or almost counterpart to the Sustainable Development Goals. I've got to the point where I think that exponential change is happening anyway, and it's not always happening in a good way. And the only way that we're going to actually survive as a species is if we work out how to develop exponential solutions, which is where the Green Swans argument came from. And I think some of the people who are working in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, they may not all be people like us, and they may not all be people who think the way that we do, and they may not all head off in directions that we particularly approve of. But there is something about the capacity of certain types of human brain, aided and augmented by computers used in the right way, that I believe can take us in the right direction if we choose to go that way. So that's not ruling out hearts. It's not ruling out our own minds. It's just saying, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to invest in it seriously. And some part of that's going to have to be ferociously powerful computers.
Well, you say that only business has the power to address critical challenges at the pace and scale that's needed, but you also say that the challenge is ultimately political, and that business needs to help de-risk the political process. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And you brought up Trump. No one else. We're worried about politics here. So,
in a way, and I'll hand over to Louise in just a second, but I've worked with business for over 40 years. I've worked with companies like Shell when they were told absolutely to stay out of politics in Nigeria or wherever it was, because you simply couldn't trust them to do the right thing if they didn't, if they lobbied, or if they, well, whatever they did, it would very likely be wrong. I think we've now got to the point where we're realizing that government does need to be helped, and it does need to be pushed, and business is going to have a very important role to play. But you know, in different countries at the moment, you can see businesses pushing around government agencies. The US Environmental Protection Agency, for example, under Trump's tutelage. In our own country, you've got business saying we need to be part of the European Union, and a very partisan government saying, oh no, you don't. And it's almost like one of these sort of pantomime things at Christmas, but it's actually a lot more dangerous than most of us think. And I think what we've got to do for government is to give clarity about what it is that government needs to do on behalf of business, on behalf of society. That doesn't mean the government will inevitably do it, but if they don't, then perhaps we can at some point wake up and vote them out.
But I can give a really concrete example. So one of the things that came out of To Nourish Capitalism was this idea that even businesses, small and large, who want to transform, don't really know how to deal with their financial sector, their investors, and how to explain, actually, by the way, we're going to go through this 6 month, 10-year, whatever transformation to be regenerative or better, bear with us. So we started a program with a group in the UK Parliament, and the program is called Bankers for Net Zero, where we bring together bankers and businesses in order to say, well, why is the capital not flowing to net zero businesses in different sectors, different sizes, fast enough? And what are the governmental barriers or enablers that could be put in place to make this capital flow faster and at higher scale? And interestingly, one of the things we've heard really clearly, so at the moment we launched it in the summer, and we're just talking both to the businesses, to the banks, and to different parts of government, and they're saying, oh, and could you tell us what they want, what they will do, what businesses and banks will do if we change the regulations like this, because they want that de-risk. They want to know that if a certain law or policy comes into play, then you've got a group of banks that have committed to financing net zero, whether it's retrofitting houses or encouraging small businesses to shift their energy providers, whatever it is, but they want that number. And I think that's the de-risking I think of, is if businesses are willing to say, we will do this, then government can kind of, they have an excuse to change policy and law in the right direction, because they really just want to get re-elected, especially in this country at the moment.
Are there governments modeling this the best? Marisa asks a great question. Who's doing it?
Finns?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Scandinavians, I would say that, even if Louise was not sitting beside me, tend to be quite good on this stuff and tend to turn up top of many of the indexes. But there's a very small group in London called Apolitical. They're a social enterprise. And one of the things that they do is to track emerging best practice across public service. Then they aggregate it, and then they make that available to public servants potentially around the world. Now, it's probably at the moment closer to journalism than it is to, an absolutely sort of staggeringly wonderful and powerful database. But for me, that's part of what we've got to do next. In a way, business has gone through the total quality management revolution in a way, and variously, some bits have got it, some people haven't. But government, to be fit for purpose, needs to be reimagined. And I think Apolitical and some of the organizations like that have a very important role to play in all of that.
Well, thank you. That brings us to time. I cannot believe how quickly that went, but we are so honored to have had you as our guests. I think we love the idea that sustainability is actually the bridge between capitalism and democracy. I never looked at it that way. And clearly, Green Swans is an essential read and roadmap for those of us trying to create a sustainable future. It gives us a framework, the rejection, responsibility, replication, resilience, and regeneration to kind of look at and walk through and model in our own lives. And I think that's a phenomenal kind of model. I want to say, John, I don't know if I've ever read a book that so graciously elevates those that came before and those that really influenced you. And I just feel that it's made all of you more accessible to us. And for those of us really dedicated in this space, that means an awful lot. And I have to say, I've never also seen anyone so deftly combine references to Charles Dickens, Ernest Hemingway, Oscar Wilde, and Goethe, right in with Anand Giridharadas, Charles Eisenstein, Kate Rayworth, Rachel Carson, and then you refer to Greta Thunberg as a one-person green swan. I'm just in awe, right? That's pretty amazing. Cannot forget to share that using the F word in connection with Jack Dorsey of Twitter really made me laugh, coining the expression global weirding and exposing what really happened.
That one was not mine, Ellie. I think that actually came from the Pacific Northwest, but I gaily grabbed it and ran with it.
It's a good one. You have so many expressions. It's just, everyone has to read it if you haven't. And then also pondering how we might take eggplant and use it into eel alternatives. It just never stops your imagination. So thank you for
I must go back and have a look at this book.
It just blew my mind, but it has inspired and ignited us as green swanlings in the flight toward transformation and abundance. So thank you so much. At Women for Solutions, we draw on our individual strengths and collectively raise our ambitions to create a better world. We commit to this every day across geographies, cultures, languages, and disciplines, and we are committed in our personal, professional, and civic lives. So we embrace and embody imaginal cells. For those that don't know what that is, these are the cells that find each other, resonate with each other, collaborate, and help transform butterflies, caterpillars into butterflies, and maybe in this case, green swans. So we hope that you will explore this idea and others on our website at bewomensolutions.com and look for upcoming webinars and workshops that we feature in English, Spanish, and Italian. Everyone is, of course, welcome to join our membership and our mailing list. So thank you again, John and Louise, and everyone here for choosing to spend time on Zoom today with us. And I'll conclude with one of my favorite lines from the book. Our species may have backed itself into the mother of all corners, but sometimes such moments are when our best work is done. So everyone be well, be safe, and be bold in your best work. And we hope to see you again here soon. Thanks again.
Thank
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Wonderful.
Thank you, both of you. This has been an amazing webinar, and I hope that we can all, as we always do at Women for Solution, we get a pen and a piece of paper, and we actually do write something that we're going to change today, that we're going to make a difference today, and you're going to do it in the next 5 minutes. So with that, please write something that you're going to change today based on what you heard, because we hear such amazing, inspiring talks, but the action is what matters.
Thank you, Laura.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much, John and Louise. Have a great rest of the day, and we will follow up with you later.
Let's do that.
We look forward to it.
Bye for now.
There you go.
Bye-bye.